Welcome back. I'm talking to Gary Heseltine about Operation Prato, which took place in 1977. This was an operation by the Brazilian military who were investigating UFO sightings and UFOs firing beams down, which was causing injuries to people's skin and even taking blood from these victims. Now then, Gary, these incidents were pretty much covered up until the 1990s. Is that true to say?
Well, I don't think anybody really became aware of them in the Western world until Captain Hollander, the man who led the military operation, contacted A.J. Javad, the Brazilian UFO researcher, and basically told his story as being the man who led the formal military operation. So
there would have been obviously people who were involved in the villages, and certain people within the military would have had knowledge of this, but it wasn't. There'd been no news programs about it.
No, I mean there'd been one or two local newspaper articles within that area of Brazil, but nothing on a national scale, and certainly wasn't known internationally.
So what year did A.J. Javad start investigating this then?
Well, he became aware of it when Captain Hollander contacted him in I think it was in June of 1997, some 20 years after the event, and he basically went on record and said, look, I'll give you an interview, I want to tell you about what I was involved in. So I mean we're forever in debt, but the story gets a little bit bizarre in the sense that Captain Hollander gives a very detailed video presentation for A.J. Javad and Marco Petit, so we have that as an historical record. He is who he said he was. We can prove and verify that he was the military rank and he was well known, etc. But the strange thing is that was in June, recorded in June of 1997. In July of 1997, A.J. Javad, Marco Petit released this story effectively to the world, and it starts to attract a lot of attention. But on the 2nd of October 1997, just 4 months after doing that video interview, Captain Hollander was found allegedly hanged in his own room in a possible suicide, and it was put down as suicide, and yet his family and the people that knew Hollander said this guy would never commit suicide. So there's some kind of bizarre element there, and some people believe he was murdered because he spoke out about what is a really credible evidential case, which could be a deal breaker, because Hollander said that there was something like 16 hours of cine footage and video footage that had been taken during that 4 months, and over 400 photographs. Well, so far to date, I think there's something like 40 or 50 photographs being released, many detailed drawings by the military witnesses, but the video, not one bit of video has come out, which could be the holy grail, as it were, the ufology, if it's as good as what Hollander said it was.
So somewhere in Brazil, possibly in the capital, locked away in a vault somewhere, 16 hours of footage shot by the military of UFOs firing these beams.
At close proximity sightings, absolutely. Loads of different craft, different shapes and sizes, seen by military witnesses and recorded on lots of cameras. Now, if you think about it, as UFO researchers, we all kind of look for this best evidence. Well, it would appear that the Brazilian government, or certainly the Brazilian Air Force, have got that. And indeed, I think it was in May of 2013, A.J. Javad sat down with the Brazilian Air Force and the Defence Minister and said, look, we're aware of this Operation Prato. You know, we know that there's video, we know that there's a lot more photographs. When are you going to release them? And they have basically said, we will work with you, and in time we will release all of this material. So at some point in the future, we are going to get to hopefully see this video footage.
Right, because A.J. Javad, you told me, has a very thick,
he presented file it at the citizens' hearings, a big thick file
in Portuguese.
And I'm going to see if I can get obviously a translated copy, because I think it's one of the very best cases in the world in terms of evidence.
Now let's just go into a little bit more detail on what these UFOs were allegedly doing to the victims. I've got some text here. It says, one of the movies that you've just referred to shows an 80 centimetre, so just under a metre long, UFO probe, which was pictured and filmed at night beside a coconut tree by Colonel Hollander's team. That probe was the same one seen in Colares, paralysing victims to retrieve materials, human blood and organic samples and minerals from the environment, according to information provided by the team in the field. So there's some kind of
experiment, it sounds like to me, that there's
so was this probe seen to come out of the UFO craft, you know, or was it coming down to the ground, or?
I think it's just coming down to the ground.
Right. So was this attached to the UFO then? This probe?
I think it's just beamed down, like it is a continuous light beam, as almost like a complete arm, a beam coming down with an object at the end.
Right.
I mean, as far as I'm aware, there were not landings per se seen by the villagers. They just basically reported at various times of the night beams being shone through the mud huts kind of thing, and the very basic kind of habitation they were living in. But certainly the military saw craft of many different sizes, and it's clear that this was some kind of, to me, experiment or surveillance of some kind. It's more than surveillance, because if surveillance by its definition means you're going to look at something, well, these aren't. This is an interaction where they're trying to retrieve something, and obviously it was for a reason. If there's blood going, if these injuries are displaying strange, like the showing deterioration within hours, that is usually days, that's odd in itself. So it implies that there was some greater meaning to this series of events. And
it might tie up with the modern day animal mutilation phenomenon, where we see these surgical holes in bodies, and we also see exsanguination. Exsanguination is a common thing in animal mutilation.
Absolutely, and I who knows what the real reason for these attacks were, but it clearly seems to have got a methodology, and certainly that, you know, people suffered a whole series of symptoms, so obviously where blood is going, you've got to start thinking of, well, this is advanced technology doing something to the human body. Why? Is this part of an ongoing program for some kind of genetic manipulation? Who knows? But clearly there is something going on that was causing physical effect.
Now, in Brazil, I'm reading here that it was under a military dictatorship at that time. Is that right? And was there any influence from the US military, do you know?
I don't know, but there's an interesting tie-up that quite recently in UFO Truth magazine, Tiago Tichetti, who's one of the Brazilian columnists, and also writes for the Brazilian UFO magazine with J. Gerard, he basically tells of a similar kind of story where two local people came across a craft that just contained two creatures, one that was clearly of a more animal type and the other one was a more grey type alien, and both were recovered, and then it was all kind of covered up. Now there's a similar tie-up to that, because Tiago Tichetti later learned that the Americans did have a hand in involvement in that and turned up at that particular case in terms of officials. So I would suspect, as you know, as we've often talked about before, America, the most secretive government in the world, clearly the lead on the subject in the world. If there's any major case, the Americans turn up. So I would think that almost certainly the Americans turned up at Colares and had some involvement. Maybe were involved in the reason why it was pulled, because they were gathering too much good evidence, I would think.
And if anyone's seen my film UFOs and NATO, it appears to be that the Americans that were in charge of mutilated human beings that were allegedly discovered on Brecon Beacons and in other areas of the UK.
Yeah, and I think there is a Brazilian link there to a case where there are some colour photographs allegedly of human mutilation in Brazil. So this isn't a million miles away from what we're talking about.
I've got a map here, Gary. I mean, this is northern Brazil where this case took place, and we are, you know, maybe, well, it is the same country, but it's over 500 miles away. South of Sao Paulo was where the case you're referring to.
But I don't think what people will realise is just how big Brazil is.
Yeah.
So, you know, we think of Britain as like 300-400 miles long.
Yeah.
Well, Brazil is an absolutely massive region.
So tell us what you think the chances are of these videos ever being released, and what AJ Gavard is up to in regards to this case now. What's the recent developments of it?
Well, he has had a series of meetings with, I think, the Brazilian Air Force and Defence Minister, and they now have a set protocol that they are actually working with the Brazilian UFO researchers to start releasing some of the very best evidence. Because obviously, if you're a researcher and you hear that there is all this great evidence of video, then we want to see it, because we know the importance of what that could be if in fact it was as verified as what Hollander said it was. So he has had a series of meetings, and apparently, I'm not sure of a timescale of release, but apparently there is a tacit approval from the Brazilian government and Air Force that they will release this material in time. And what's important is that they acknowledge the fact that they do have it, and that's the key thing.
My hunch would be that because it involves human beings being harmed, if you look at comments such as Bill Cooper from the 1990s, where he said that human bodies were discovered, or body parts on recovered sources and that kind of thing, that is what made them tie the lid down on the UFO secret, because it was such a horrific thing to release. So my hunch would be that if they did release stuff, they might release some images of craft, but probably not the more harmful aspect of it.
Well, no, and it's an emotive thing, really, because if you think about it, it is a terrifying thing if people are dying, if people are getting mutilated and bodies are turning up all around the world. Then this is not something that governments or the Americans say would want to openly get out there, because there is the element of panic there. This is raising the UFOs to a completely different level. There's one thing, craft being seen in the sky, but there's another thing if they're hostile. And if you think about the American take and the British MOD stance, which is they're of no defence significance, which in reality I've always interpreted, and what they've actually said is because they're not hostile. Well, this would be the actual opposite. They are hostile. If indeed there are human mutilations, as case in the Brecon Beacons, if that was indeed real, and you believe that it is, then that case would prove that there is an hostility to the ET presence. And that it would change the whole dynamic.
But the whole thing becomes classified.
Absolutely, and you could argue in some ways that there may be reasons not to panic the public about that, genuine reasons. So you get into when people are dying, and there is a hostile threat by one or more species, then it does change the dynamics, because you can understand why it would be classified. But the fact is, I think the public still need to be told.
All right, well, thanks for that then, Gary. We're going to go to another break, and after the break we're going to talk more about ufology.